right? You make her happy, so you'll be all right.
And happy wife normally is about happy life for me.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It ain't about her, it's about you.
So Van says that because Jewish people showed up for Black Americans during the Civil Rights era, he now feels compelled to stand with them now. Let me be clear.
What's the white liberal ideology I'm following?
I'm not saying you.
No, that's what you said. So I'm saying, which one?
No one is free until we are all free. There's no room for any injustice.
Peace, family. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. It is time for office hours. That's right. Every Sunday night here on the channel, we hold office hours. That is a deep dive intellectual conversation with a brilliant mind, someone who can help us break something down in great depth. Sometimes it's a topic, sometimes it's an idea, sometimes it's a book. The person we have today, Dr. Charisse Stelly, y'all seen her before. She came on about 6 weeks ago. She has all of them things. She got great ideas. She helps us unpack complex things. Ignore that siren in the background. They coming after us. And she also has a brilliant body of work. Although she is relatively new to the academy, she somehow has managed to write more books and put out more work than a whole bunch of folk. And it's all good work too. Anyway, I brought her on so that we can have a really deep dive conversation about a couple of things. Charisse, it's good to see you.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, I had to unmute.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
Everybody out there who's celebrating Father's Day, happy Father's Day to everybody out there. Also, Eid Mubarak to all my Muslim brothers and sisters out there who are celebrating Eid al-Adha. Anyway, so much going on in the world. I wanted to bring you on. One, I was just really excited about your book, which is incredible. And I with you, I should say which book, because you got enough of them. But I specifically wanted to talk about this one. That's right. Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, because there are a couple of major themes and a couple of major ideas here that I want you to help us understand. But I also want to put it in conversation with just what's going on in the world, so it's less like an academic lecture and more just like a talk, just a conversation, especially at this moment.
Yeah.
Black Scare, Red Scare. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is something that's come up in office hours before, and it's come up on the channel before, and that's a question about Black nationalism. And sort of how we can think about these different strands of our liberation struggle. You often identify with the Black radical tradition. You talk about being a communist, a Black communism. And then there's this question of Black nationalism. And for a lot of people in our circles, especially university circles, feminist circles, progressive circles, when nationalism has developed a very negative connotation. People start to think about it as being like the crudest form of our liberation struggle. It's anti-woman, it's anti-this, it's anti-that. And so I guess my question is, how do you sort of think about Black nationalism? How should we think about Black nationalism? It's sort of throughout history and now even.
Yeah. I'm a socialist with nationalist characteristics, right? So, I identify as like a Rodneyist, right? So Marxist Leninist with the Black world as my locus of enunciation. But Black nationalism is hugely important. And I think that like Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism spans the ideological spectrum. So you can have like a quite conservative Black nationalism, what some people might attribute to like the Nation of Islam, through like revolutionary Black nationalism of the Black Panther parties before they sort of pivoted to revolutionary intercommunalism. But Black nationalism is hugely important because at the basis of Black nationalism, irrespective of ideology, is self-determination. Black people being able to determine our destinies, to organize our politics and economics to the benefit of uplifting Black people. Now, I think the issues come in when one is considering like who counts, right? As the people, where do you start uplift? Is it at the middle? Is it at the top? Or is it truly at the bottom? Where do gender oppressed and sexually marginalized people fit in? Where do poor people fit in, right? Because even though some strands of Black nationalism purport to be in the interest of the majority, they are not, right? They're based on perhaps moral suasion or racial uplift ideologies that really demonize or marginalize poor folks. And so, I think that Black nationalism is something, it is, so there's a debate, right? Whether Black nationalism or Black liberalism are the oldest ideology among Black people. So Michael Doxson talks about this in his book about Black political ideologies. But anyway, so I think nationalism is hugely important, especially in its internationalist enunciations. And now some might think that nationalism and internationalism are contradictory, but they're not, right? Because a revolutionary nationalism, for example, is internationalist in its focus. And so anybody who, I think that there's no ideology or no political formation that's above critique, but anybody who denies like the importance of Black nationalism really is denying a huge facet of Black history.
Why has, if I'm reading you right, why has Black nationalism caused such, not just moral panic, but really like political panic? Why has it been such a terrifying prospect for America, for the white sort of political or public imagination in general? Sort of, why is the idea of Black nationalism so terrifying, and specifically, like what strand? Is it just the idea of Black self-determination, or is it the particular expressions of Black nationalism vis-a-vis a Nation of Islam or a Garvey movement that's saying we want our own geographic, like we want our own cities, we want our own states, we want our own land? Is it about undermining the sort of the structures of American capitalism? Like, what is it about Black nationalism that's so terrifying and that always warrants the kind of state, surveillance state, violent state? Why? What is it about it that causes that?
I think that it's the ability to organize, galvanize, and mobilize like the Black masses, because the Black, ordinary Black people, working poor Black people, which make up the majority of our race, so to speak, are deemed many things by the U.S. state, but one of which is uniquely susceptible to foreign ideologies or to outside agitators or to radical ideology. And so I think that Black nationalism, because of its ability to attract the people who the U.S. both simultaneously relies on for accumulation, but also relies on as a reserve army of labor as well, right? And to warehouse and to also profit ideologically off, right? I think that this group being mobilized to its own ends and its own interests is actually really dangerous. And to be completely frank, the United States government has targeted all facets of Black nationalism. So, for example, the Nation of Islam was targeted because of its ostensible connections to the Japanese, right? The Garvey movement was targeted because of its anti-Euro-American imperialism. Of course, the Black Panthers were decimated by the U.S. government because of their relationship with Vietnam and with Cuba and with.
You're saying it's always internet. You're saying that it's never disconnected from a kind of global political imaginary.
It can be, right? So I think that there are more sort of ethnic pluralist enunciations of Black nationalism that are about, having control of particular neighborhoods or communities that don't necessarily have an internationalist focus. But ultimately, any forms of Black nationalism that are anti-capitalist or anti-racial capitalist, right? That is to say, anti-capitalism that specifically targets Black labor and uses Black labor for the purpose of super exploitation. It's necessarily internationalist because capitalism is an internationalist system. And so all of these, even cultural nationalism, so I think cultural nationalism has probably been the most tolerated, a particular sort of anemic culturalist, what I would say culturalist form of cultural nationalism, that is to say culture that's abstracted from political economy, has probably been the most tolerated. But even a cultural nationalism like emanating from the Black arts movement is seen as dangerous because, as they say, culture is the sort of first thing to be attacked in an imperialist situation. And cultural imperialism is such a large part of the U.S. Project. And so, to make a short story long, I think what's so dangerous about Black nationalism in a racial capitalist post-slave settler colony, having a group of people who are who can be organized against the sort of ideology and interests of the U.S. state is dangerous. It only portends destabilization, threat to national security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we see this not only with Black people, we saw it with the so-called Asian peril. We see it with the so-called, of course, the terrorist discourse. So racialized people who are refusing a particular type of assimilation or integration are seen as dangerous.
I'm watching people in the comments here talk about cultural nationalism as well, and the power and possibility of it. I had a conversation on the Classroom in the Cell maybe a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, with Mumia Abu-Jamal, and he and I don't fully agree on this point. In fact, we disagree. I think he puts a lot of weight on cultural nationalism. He believes, and he's a product of that era. You know, he was outside when West Philly High is changing. They're teaching Swahili, and he got the name Mumia. He was Wesley till he had a teacher at West Philly that was willing to say, hey, we're going to teach you Swahili and we're going to give you this name, Mumia. He sees the value in Kwanzaa and in all. And it's not that I don't see the value in those things. But there's a way. It's not coincidental to me that the most enduring forms of nationalism out of those struggles seem to be the cultural ones. It's not coincidental to me that we can have all the names you can have all the names you want. You can have all the Swahili you want, but
all the kente cloth,
and it's like it's there's a way that we could see that as two kind of parallel roads, and one is just going, and you want the other one to keep up. But I see it almost as the cultural nationalism was the bait and switch. Like, oh, y'all want liberation movements? Take these. And as long as we can still extract labor from you and exploit you, we can exploit Jamal or we can exploit John. We can exploit you in denim or we can exploit you in kente. Am I being insufficiently generous to cultural nationalism? Or is there, when we talk about Black nationalism, or is there more, or is there something else I should be thinking about? Because I read it quite cynically, and I support cultural nationalism. I'm just saying, I don't see it as the success story that many people do, and I see it as actively undermining more concrete material forms of liberation struggle.
I think that what makes cultural nationalism slippery is that it is easily commodifiable, right? Black aesthetics are easily commodifiable. And so if culture becomes reduced to food and clothes and names and those types of things so Cabral defines culture essentially as how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we relate to our environment. And modes of production come out of culture, right? And so this is why in my dissertation long ago,
you said modes of production come out of culture?
Yeah. So the way that you organize your economy has to do with your cultural foundation, right? If you have communal values, if your culture is rooted in like communal values, if it's rooted in like gerontocracy, if it's rooted in age grade systems, et cetera, your economy and your politics are going to be organized in that way. And so Cabral defines culture as the sort of totality of how we organize our societies. But
you shocked me with that, by the way.
Because there's a sort of materialist understanding of culture, then there's a sort of anthropological understanding of culture that I think is the sort of dominant mode, where it's just sort of performative. It's just aesthetics, right? And so I think that if we have a revolutionary understanding of culture, then we see the importance of we see the importance of a cultural nationalism, an anti-imperialist, sort of anti-colonial cultural nationalism, but that's not how it's articulated in this space, right? It's not articulated in that way in the context of the United States by and large. The primary cultural nationalisms that are cultural nationalists that we think about are like Umar Johnson, right? These sorts of folks who have a particular performance of a Black or African culture, but that don't have a broader understanding of how we have to organize our politics and our economy. Is simply about aesthetics or performance. But culture is important, right? So, because, again, as Cabral says, like, you cannot have a true revolution without a cultural revolution, right? If you continue to have like a Western orientation, Western values, Western worship, Western gods, and that sort of thing, you're not going to have it's not a true revolutionary culture. It's not the only thing that you need, but it's certainly essential to cultural relocation, as they call it.
Someone's writing in Quadwo Duane Dieterville. I think he's not interpreting, at least you, maybe he's got me right, but I don't think he's got you right here. He says, you all are being intellectually dishonest in regards to the complexity of revolutionary Black cultural nationalism. It's not reducible to kente cloth. It's ontological political education as well. I didn't understand you to be saying that, but you, I'd love for you to respond to that if you could.
So the thing is, we're not talking, I think that revolutionary Black cultural nationalism is what I'm describing through the discourse of Amilcar Cabral. But all cultural nationalism is not revolutionary Black nationalism. In fact, some of it's quite conservative, quite backward, quite consonant with capitalism, quite consonant with imperialism. It really is just, the American dream in blackface, if you will. So I don't think we're being intellectually dishonest. I think that we're being precise in what we're talking about.
Yeah. I think Quadwo, I think you're right. I think we're all saying cultural nationalism isn't reducible to kente cloth. We're saying that the more superficial and the forms of the articulations of cultural nationalism that are not revolutionary are often reducible to kente cloth or superficially identified that way. We're not saying that's what it is. We're saying that's how it's often. Anyway, I don't want to linger there, but I wanted to at least get that out. So this is an interesting moment to talk about the piece that you just said, which is the kind of conservative thrust that underpins a lot of Black nationalist ideas. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I'm watching these numbers in the polls, and I'm watching Black men identify as pro-Trump. Not overwhelming numbers, but just, I think the media grossly overstates how many people are doing that. I think it's like, oh my God, 8% of Black people are voting for Trump as opposed to 6%, because there's this idea that we're indebted to Democrats. So anything else seems like the sky is falling for the other side. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because when I've talked to people or heard people talk about their connection to Trump or their connection to the Republican Party, even their connection to MAGA, they often appeal to nationalist ideals. Mm-hmm. They say, we don't want to be on a Democratic plantation anymore. We want self-determination. We want to determine our own outcome. We're not going to be beholden to anybody. And these principles of self-determination, of limited government, of these sort of Republican principles are actually in line with a Black nationalist ideology. What do you say to the people, or how do you make sense of that kind of political analysis from people who are identifying with Black nationalism, but identifying not just with the kind of conservatism that goes with, say, a Nation of Islam ideology, but actually mainstream political, corporate kind of conservatism as well?
Mm-hmm. So there's the what, and then there's the so what. I often say that sometimes radicalism, like left radical discourse and conservative discourse, can sound similar, but it's the so what that makes the difference. So sure, limited government is important in the context of, historically the government, you know, the federal government at particular historical moments have shown up for Black people, but by and large, the U.S. government is, the purpose of the U.S. government is to uphold the status quo, which is a white supremacist capitalist society. And so there's a real contradiction. So on the one hand, the government is actually the enemy of Black people, but on the other hand, the federal government vis-a-vis states' rights and the state governments has been the main apparatus to intervene on behalf of Black people. And so I think that to the degree that, you know, the government impinges, its job is to uphold the interests of the ruling class, and having a limited government is good. But in the context of, again, a slaveocracy settler colony, having no government intervention means that there's no mechanism for redistribution. There's no mechanism for at least upholding the things the state claims it believes in. And so that's the contradiction. And so I think that when the right is talking about no state intervention, they're like, leave those niggas to die. I think when Black people are talking about no state intervention, it's we have to, Black people want to have the material, political, social, you know, and cultural resources to take care of ourselves. And if we are actually left to our own devices in that way, and not mass incarcerated and not sort of lynched or undermined when we try to build up our own communities, not having our communities flooded with terrible food and drugs, et cetera, then we do want limited government. We do want, you know, we don't want the state intervening on what we do. And so I think that the context really matters. And I think that as nationalists, we have to be serious about where we're actually at, right? About what are all the tools in our toolkits to be able to build what some people call dual power, to be able to actually control our communities and what that actually means in real time. Because ultimately, right, being on the so-called Democratic plantation has meant, on the one hand, more funding of the police. It's meant, you know, the substitute for actual, you know, so-called social welfare is the prison industrial complex. But this idea that, and so you mentioned that there are, you know, whatever, marginally more Black men voting for Trump. Well, there's also this discourse that Black women keep saving democracy, right?
Mm-hmm. And by saving democracy,
if it is that democracy means leaving Black people to what George Jackson called butchered half-lives, what is that responsibility?
Right.
And so I think that we need to be politically serious about what are the actual possibilities of electoralism and what are the other forms of politics in which we're engaging before we condemn people about this or that party they vote for, as if this is not a one-party state with two factions.
Well, that's part of the analysis that I want you to help us think through, because it's that time of the decade, you know, at least twice a decade, mm-hmm. where people are voting for president and liberals are saying the sky is falling and this is the worst Republican we've ever seen. And if we don't close ranks around the Democratic candidate, who may be imperfect, but at least cares about us, we are going to face
who is us.
Right. These are all the right questions, right? They don't necessarily specify. Sometimes they say y'all, right? Meaning Black folks. Sometimes they say us, meaning poor people. Sometimes they say basically anybody who's reasonable, you know, but the argument is ultimately that the world the world's on fire and it's only going to get worse. And the only fireman is the Democratic Party. And so we start to have these conversations about whether the distinctions are legitimate between these two parties. And then as Black folk in particular, the question becomes, you know, how do we get a party that has a captured electorate? That is to say, Black folk ain't going nowhere. We vote Democrat somewhere between 88 and 94% in these elections. If that's our political reality, there doesn't seem to be a real way to leverage anything from Democrats. And so how do we imagine or reimagine what political action looks like, what political community looks like, and what our political futures can be in light of a political system that seems to always allow for no possibility other than to, like you said, to basically similar, if not identical, political parties that are born out of the same set of economic interests and ruling class control. what do we do? How do you make sense of that kind of moment? And does the Trump, I know it's a long ass question, and does the Trump thing piece of it complicate it for you? Because there's a way that Trump is different than everybody else. And I don't want to be dishonest about that either. There is something different about Trump, in as we saw in the last Trump presidency. So how do you make sense of all of this?
I remember in 2016, I guess it was in 2016 when it was announced that Trump was elected, there were massive protests, right? And in fact, throughout the early part of his presidency, especially after the so-called Muslim ban, and with the border wall shit, right? There was so much organizing about kids in cages, right? Like there was so much organizing and so liberal, people were, in their either in their nonprofits or in their organizations, taking to the streets to really organize about this particular issue. The border is more militarized under Biden, right? Do you remember when the Haitians were getting bullwhipped by the Border Patrol? There's still family separation. And now a new executive order has been handed down that, says that people can be deported on the spot after crossings reach 2,500.
Yes, which we're already at. So it's basically
right?
Yeah.
And so I've seen no protests. I haven't even seen that many tweets about it.
No.
So this is why I think the analytic of genocide is really important, because the thing about genocide is not reducible to annihilation. It's not reducible to extermination. Genocide also talks about like slow death, right? A particular rate of oppression that wears us down over time. So we continue to negotiate the terms of our immiseration.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have an answer about whether Trump is better or worse than Biden. I don't give a fuck about that. What are we doing?
Right.
What are we doing? Politics is not reducible to electoralism. So there was this argument.
Let me ask you a question about that. But to what extent do we need to have a clear analysis of that point, right? That about the relative distinctions between the two in order to usher us into that new space. In other words, if I begin from the premise that Trump is the boogeyman and a monster and just a wildly different sort than Biden, then it inspires a kind of all hands on deck kind of commitment to electoral politics. But if through political education we recognize that the outcomes aren't that different, then we can logically say, well, if they ain't that different, what should we be doing instead? But it seems like we haven't even done the political work. Sometimes I worry that we haven't done the political work to even make clear that there's no worthwhile distinction between these two at a certain analytical level. And so it's hard to get people to redirect toward other kinds of political activity because we still think the world's on fire and the only way to put it out is to vote Democrat. So like, you know what I mean? So I'm just thinking about how do we get, I'm just trying to think through how to get at that analytic stuff at that level so that we can redirect people over there. Because as long as people think that Republicans are the boogeyman, it's going to be real hard to get them to do, grassroots political organizing or teaching or, all this other stuff, which people will see as less urgent.
But so that's sort of what I'm talking. I don't see why electoral politics would determine, or electoralism would determine what we're doing on the ground. And so I think that the problem is we reduce politics to electoralism, and not only electoralism, but in every 4 years electoralism, right? Sometimes people will talk about every 2 years. That's become more important in recent years. But I think that if we were organized, we being Black people, oppressed people, poor people, if we did have our own institutions, or we're moving toward that, right? If we did have coalitions, if we were mobilized so that when something like the decimation that's happening to Gaza right now, we were able to actually shut some shit down, electoralism would be probably third or fourth in terms of political importance. It would not be the first thing, but I think that the over reliance on national electoral politics is what undermines us from being organized in the way that we need to be. And so I can't have any solution other than that. because I just can't. So if you look at Biden, correct?
Yeah.
I would argue there was a larger stimulus, the stimmy under Trump, right?
Definitely got a bigger stimmy under Trump.
Right. And so one would argue that every single thing Biden said he was going to do, he did not do, and in fact did the opposite. So police are better funded, more militarized. The U.S. is engaged in at least 3 wars abroad. And all of that always redounds back to the U.S. with more militarism of the police, because these people train abroad. They share techniques of domination. You remember student debt? Still got it. You remember Build Back Basic? Oh, I think it's called Build Back Better, whatever. I call it the Build Back Basic. They're not even passed. They passed some infrastructure bill. A fucking bridge just collapsed like 2 months ago in Baltimore. Infrastructure is crumbling everywhere. And so it's sort of like, it's as if people want a government that spits on your cupcakes, that pisses on you and tell you it's rain, right? As opposed to simply saying the quiet part out loud. And I don't know that that's not enough for me.
Well, I think part of how you're able to have that kind of a rich analysis is because of your political formations, because of how you've come to understand our political economic reality. But I want to get to that part of your book, but I also want you to kind of just take a step back and tell me, as an organizer, as a thinker, and just as a human being navigating this settler colony, how did you talk to me a little bit about the story of your own political formation?
It's funny, but books. And so this is why I'm always pushing the old reading, right? Because I don't come from a movement family. Like, I just study. And I really sort of funnily enough, I came to consciousness, as it were, through Afrocentricity, right? As sometime as an undergraduate, right? And I think a lot of people's origin story, so to speak, right, come through Afrocentrism. So for a lot of men, that's when they join the Nation of Islam or the 5%ers or the Hebrew Israelites. They read Hidden Colors. For me, I read, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. I watched John Henrik Clarke's A Great and Mighty Walk.
Afrocentric. You was in the.
I went through my white purge. I went natural. I became the president of the Black Student Government. I founded co-founded this organization, Nzinga Sisterhood Circle. A lot, right? All of this, and so that's why I will always have a particular respect and affinity, because I think that it was important to my consciousness raising. I moved through it ultimately to become like a Marxist, but it's why I came to Marxism through Rodney and not like Marx per se. I read those people on the back end, but it was through study and through sort of different mentors that I had, through dialogue and through that analyzing the sort of historical and contemporary situation. And so it was a white purge. I have no white friends for like a year and a half. And so I think, and then I joined an organization very belatedly, but I will say, like in 2020, joining an organization like changed my life in the sense that it changed the types of questions that I asked, the conversations that I cared about, the types of things that I wanted to write and for whom. And so I think, and I always try to keep abreast of what's happening abroad, reading beyond the mainstream media. And history is important. If you don't understand history, you don't understand the international situation, said a mentor of mine, then you really don't understand shit, right? You have to be able to understand those things. And so I think that is what allows me to have a particular perspective. And I get things wrong, right? But I'm not believing the hype. I think, the United States, we have the most highly propagandized population in the world. And I think that's why study is so important, because insofar as we're in the battle of ideas, we have to have an alternative perspective and narrative. And so I think political education is really important. Study is really important.
One of the things we do here in office hours is direct people toward resources for deep study for that very reason. And the challenge is, particularly in the digital space, is that people want sound bites. They want Wikipedia. They want they want hashtags.
Mm-hmm.
How does the current sort of technological moment, the current social arrangement, we don't engage each other in movement spaces in the same way. A lot of the organizing's online, which I'm very skeptical of, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm.
How much more difficult is it to develop a real kind of rigorous project of deep study and political education at this juncture in history versus, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? For me, 30 years ago is when I was reading those books. I was in Black bookstores. I was in organizing circles. I was in organizations, and we were actually in buildings, meeting, talking, and knowing each other, and and it wasn't foolproof. There's always agents, and there's always undercovers, and there's always all that stuff. But there's something about knowing who you're building with, and who you're organizing with, and who you're teaching, and who you're learning from that was different to me. But we were committed to deep study. We read books, at least we pretended to. Now, I'm not even.
People still pretended,
right? But it's like now, it's like the level of, I don't know. Again, maybe I'm just old and getting older and getting cranky, but I'm just not. I'm very disappointed with the lack of intellectual rigor and depth in some of the movement spaces that I'm seeing now. I remember being, was it 20? It was during the Ferguson summer, and one of the leaders, I won't say who it was, but one of the leaders, at least the white media said, was a leader of the movement at a Ferguson. He expressed surprise in a conversation that Malcolm X died before Martin Luther King. And it's a small thing, right? You don't have to know that. But they were sort of positioning him, but it was clearly coloring his analysis of what Black Power movement. He didn't understand sort of the relationship between Malcolm and the Panthers. He didn't understand the relationship between all these different movements, SNCC, SCL. So he didn't understand these movements. And I was like, just one book would fix that for you, right? Just one solid book, much less all the books you should be reading. And I was really surprised as we talked more about the lack of a sense of history in general with him.
Mm-hmm.
And this is somebody who's supposed to be well-read and thoughtful and a leader, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't want to be nostalgic. Everybody was reading in the 90s, but damn, I don't know. Anyway, the question was, how does this moment, I'm frustrated at the same time, how does this moment sort of complicate how we do political education, how we learn, how we develop a rigorous politics?
I think it's a double-edged sword, because I will say, on the one hand, the fact that there is so much capacity to meet online allows for people to create community and to create those study and reading circles via like a Zoom or whatever. Us being able to have this conversation, somebody being able to watch this conversation
Right.
is different, as opposed to in the 90s, right? Pulling out your VHS tape or whatever, right? And so I think that that's a good thing. I think we have more we have more knowledge digitized and accessible than ever. On the other hand, I think people are much more invested in demonstrating mastery than engaging in deep study, and we're too afraid to go slow because of the hyper speed of like technology and of our society, like the soundbite era. People don't want to go slow. And so that's why people hate reading, because sometimes it takes you a long time to read, right? Sometimes, and especially because oftentimes in K through 12 education, reading is used punitively.
Yes.
And so, and as a means of embarrassment. And so people hate reading. They have a very negative relationship with reading. And I understand that, but it's like, you can read 2 pages, right? Read out loud to each other. And this is why we say read collectively, because if you don't understand something, or if you get tired of reading, then the next person can read, right? I do round robin reading a lot in both study groups, but also in my classroom, because I know if you ain't reading shit on the syllabus, you at least read this one thing. And so this can ground our conversation. And I will say, it's not just reading, because now there are podcasts, there's documentaries, there are other study tools, but I don't think any of that can replace reading. And so I just think that, and there is a deep anti-intellectualism in our society. There really is. And I think that a lot of that is the fault of academics, because academics have been extractive, pompous, exploitative, terrible fucking people. That's not everybody, and I'm around them all the time, so I could say that. As Walter Rodney said, academics are enemies of the people until proven otherwise.
Yep.
But I think to prove otherwise is the historical task, right? It's what is our responsibility. And so I think it's a double-edged sword. It is, in some ways, it's easier to have to study deeply and have a collective, but it is more difficult when I think people want to influence and not lead, right? People want to demonstrate mastery and not study. People want to convene, but not necessarily forge collectives. So those are different things. It's part of the superficiality that we've been talking about.
What is convening instead of creating a collective? Like, I understand the kind of demonstrate mastery rather than, because that becomes like a performative intellectuality.
Mm-hmm.
But what does convening look like versus building collectives? How does that play out?
Pull up. You just pull up to some shit, right? It's like what I had said previously in terms of the different tones and tenors of encampments. There's people who are just kicking it for Palestine. And then there's people who actually had whatever, right? But that's convening. But then there were people who had actual political objectives. So that's the difference between and building community and is important to have two political objectives, because you have to trust people around you. You have to actually you have to coordinate with people around you in order to achieve political objectives. But if you just pulling up, you convening, you kicking it for Palestine, you know what I mean? You don't have to have any of that stuff, but you have your picture for the gram,
Right.
So,
right.
And so much of that stuff is dry snitching. Like, it's reproducing or contributing to the surveillance state, right? And so, I don't know. I think that there are reasons to sort of be frustrated or to never to despair, right? Because despair is counter-revolutionary. But I think there's reasons to be frustrated, reasons to be for a particular type of melancholy. But I also think that despite all that has happened, we're still organizing. We're still creating new and meaningful ways to challenge structures of domination. And I think that matters.
Talk to me about those structures of domination. What role does capitalism play in sort of how you understand the world, what your political your most radical and ambitious freedom dream is? Mm-hmm. Where does capitalism play in all this? It's also a central theme I want to add in your book, as you talk about kind of the Red Scare and what that has meant historically. And again, we could look to this juncture in history again, particularly when this latest wave of the culture wars, this latest wave of political repression, and it's again steeped in a certain kind of red baiting, everything from our discourse about China and Russia to how we're talking about silencing certain kind of academic discourses in the university. And Marxism is now becoming an almost catch-all for all the kind of intellectual and moral panics of the right. Talk to me about capitalism first, and we'll get to the other stuff.
Yeah, so, I define at least sort of racial capitalism, capitalist racism, as I call it, as like a war-driven, racially hierarchical political economy that is, that sort of is constituted by super exploitation, expropriation, and domination. And so what that means is that we're taught in our economics courses that capitalism is like the exchange of goods and services in the marketplace, and there's this invisible hand. That's not what capitalism is. Capitalism is the organized, protracted method of accumulation whereby resources, land, labor, capital, bodies are accumulated and concentrated at the top. So a very, very tiny class of people own, control, and hoard massive amounts of resources to the detriment of the majority. So this is a dialectical process, right? It's not just that people at the top win and everybody else is just kind of like, okay, no, that means that fundamentally so many other people have to lose, right? Are reduced to bare life. And so that is what capitalism is. And then capitalism breeds a bunch of different sort of social relations, like, or antisocial relations, right? Alienation, individualism and hyper-individualism, competition, monopoly, right? And so it's a system that can only ultimately be geared toward death dealing, whether that's people, whether that is the environment, right? Ecologies, whole life worlds. And Lenin, right, and as well as Du Bois argue that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and that is what we're seeing currently. These different imperial formations, including it in its settler colonial form in places like Israel and the United States, by the way. And we see the death dealing. We see the ways that whole populations of people are just rendered disposable. And that's where, again, where culture comes in, because then we become acculturated to normalize those things, to value those things, to work for those things, right? And to devalue and devalorize persons, places, and things that don't allow us to inhabit that drive, and that, are deemed like superfluous to, or sort of like inferior within the context of the system. So that's my understanding of capitalism.
And so, one more thing, because you make a distinction between, or you frame it as capitalist racism. Mm-hmm. We know there's been, again, it's become almost like a tick among academics. Now everybody says racial capitalism. Mm-hmm. I'm not always sure that people know what they mean or have read carefully or closely when they use that language. But I'm going to suspend that for that critique for a moment, because there's some particular people I could say, particularly when I'm reading in the disciplines, particularly sociology. Sometimes I'm like, this is where y'all land on this. But what is capitalist racism? Can we understand it the way that we are taught to understand racial capitalism, which is that it's not a particular or unique genre of capitalism, but that all capitalism is racial capitalism, and that the very formation of a class defending state also hinges upon processes of racialism, and that they always have, even if they've played out in different historical epochs differently. In other words, is there any when we say capitalist racism, is there any racism that isn't born out of capitalism? And is there any formation of capitalism that doesn't demand a certain kind of process of racialization and thus racism?
So I think the answer to the latter question is no. Racism, racial formation, racial hierarchy, and process of racialization are endemic in the capitalist system as such. Whether or not racism preceded the capitalist form, maybe. I mean, Cedric Robinson argues that it does. I use the term capitalist racism because I think that the anti-Black racial oppression, for example, and the forms of racial formation that we see are part of the takeoff of the capitalist world system as such. I don't think that they're holdovers from feudalism. And I think that some of what is called racialism in the feudal order is ethno-nationalist differentiation. It's other forms of labor hierarchy. That's not race in the way that
we understand
we understand it, and the way that it's operationalized through, through the internationalization of the capitalist system. And so that's why I use the term capitalist racism. And it's also to sort of evade the debate. Like, I don't have a dog in the racial capitalist fight. I have my critique of Cedric Robinson, but like, I don't have a dog in the fight in terms of proving him wrong. I just think that, if it is that we're in a battle of ideas, having precise in careful language is really important, which is why I use the term like structural location of Blackness. That's why I use the term like capitalist racism. And maybe it's wrong. And in fact, when I was writing my book, one of the reader reports was like, just use racial capitalism. And I was like, no. So
I struggled with that with your book. And when I say struggle, I understood the distinction you were making, and it was not a superficial one. There are academics who make distinctions just so they can have their own term, just so that they can be cited. You were making an I'm sorry. Somebody said, where the glossary at? We use I'll make sure we define and clarify as much as possible. But I understood the distinction you were making, and I wondered that question of, is it not a distinction without a difference, but what is the sort of ultimate value in that distinction for the not at the analytical level, but at the political level? And I wasn't sure. Again, I don't think you're wrong. I need to sit with. I was like, I need to read a book again and sit with that idea. But in either case, as you think about the project of capitalist racism, how do we I want to think about it at the level of dismantling it, but I also want to think about sort of what is how does that present itself in the 21st century? In other words, we've seen, when we talk about racial capitalism, and capitalist racism, we can think about a slave-holding state, and then we could think about a carceral state. This is still bound up in the kind of imperialist ambitions of the American nation state and the various imperial projects that you just named, including through our client states like Israel. Where is this going? Like, can you forecast the next sort of articulation of capitalist racism? Can you help us think through what's possibly on the horizon, or are we in the finalized state of it? Is this the ultimate expression of it, and it just gets more intensified?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, because part of how capitalist racism operates is sort of like, one of the tenets is like, what we call last hired, first fired. And so this is where we need to think about the question of increased automation and AI. And so I think that one horizon is more warehousing of like superfluous populations, because part of the function of prisons is warehousing, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore has conveyed in her work on prisons. And so we have more warehousing in these highly militarized encampments, right? Whether it's prisons, whether it's ICE facilities, for example. So that's another sort of, and that's just an intensification of what's already happening. We might get to a point where we do just see the wholesale sort of eradication of populations, because right now it's still uneven. But if we look at what's happening in Sudan, right? If we look at what's happening in Congo, it's not as if it's not happening. The whole sort of the literal decimation of populations is already happening. I think that what we'll also continue to see is like the multiculturalization of the ruling class to reproduce white power, to reproduce white supremacy, right? Not to undermine it. Because if you have a few chips in the cookie, it gives it the valence of legitimacy, and it also has a particular ethical force, right? And so if you see like, oh, but Obama was president, now it's like a whole generation of Black people want to be fucking president of the United States, which is crazy, right? And so, I think, and also this is the sort of global phenomenon. I think that there's the global axial division of labor is racialized, right? It's not just about sort of Black people, but it's like the global axial division of labor is racialized, and particular types of labor are devalorized because they're racialized, even when they become inhabited by white people, right? So this happened in the Great Depression, for example. Domestic labor was something that had been not exclusively, but generally associated with Black people. But as the economy failed, right, white folks, white women in particular, took those jobs from Black women and forced Black women out to what was called one example of this is like the Bronx slave market, which is the even more exploitative, precarious, contingent form of domestic service. And so the more secure forms of domestic service went to white people. And so these are nigger jobs until white people want them or need them again. So I think that those are some of the things that we can anticipate. Pending revolution. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. Like, it doesn't have work and labor don't have to be organized this way, domestically or internationally. But this is somebody's freedom dream. Somebody thinks this is free.
For sure. So I'm going to take it back to your political formation, and then I want to move into sort of how we could rearrange the current social order. How do you get to socialism? How do you arrive at socialism?
My dissertation advisor is a Marxist, a Guyanese Marxist. And so when I was doing my dissertation, I was reading a lot of like the plantation school theorists. So like Lloyd Best, Norman Gervin, etc. I was reading a lot of Rodney, and then I was also reading W. Arthur Lewis, who's a more like Fabian economist, and how I won't say his stuff was goofy, but how just sort of untenable, his plan for Caribbean development was. I was initially gonna as a side note, was gonna do my dissertation on development economics, so on export processing zones in Jamaica. So I was really into development economics and the sort of theory around it at one point. And so I think that reading the sort of world systems literature, as well as sort of Marxist analyses of colonialism and neocolonialism, I was convinced by the sort of failures of capitalism and also the potential for how society could be organized, namely Ujamaa. And so Ujamaa failed because there was
Ujamaa is.
So Ujamaa is the form of socialism that was implemented in Tanzania up until maybe the 1980s. Don't hold me to that timeline, but it was a form of socialism with peasants and agricultural labor sort of at the center. But there were contradictions that were baked in, as Walter Rodney has written a critique and written about the failures of Tanzania and Ujamaa. But it could potentially work, right? So Cuba, again, and none of these all of these forms of socialism are imperfect, because when you have a socialist system in the context of a capitalist world economy, there's going to be antagonisms that structure what's possible because of blockades, because of international interference, because of the ways that so much of one's budget has to go toward defense. All of these things create a malformed state. And it's a continued reliance on a particular Westphalian state. So anyway, to make a short story long, I came to socialism through books.
which is super interesting to me. Because most people, I'm also showing people some as we're going, I'm like putting up some of the text you've written or edited. But a lot of people come to socialism through organizing, through activist collectives, etc., and then, or local political education, and then they sort of land into the academic world, or they land into the theoretical world. Most people don't come to socialism through their dissertation or through scholarly reading so it's a fascinating journey. How did you negotiate this tension between sort of becoming increasingly radical in your political vision and entering a university system, an academy as a professor that is so bound up in all the things that your politics would seem to oppose?
Well, when I describe this jokingly, I say I have no other skills. It was either the academy or the pole. So here I am in the academy, right? And this could all go pear-shaped, and I might go get my BBL and start anew. But anyway, and I said this elsewhere, I just sort of made a pact with myself that I would get as far as I can get in the academy, being myself and being steadfast in my principles. And that has, and suffering is relative, right? But I've suffered for that, right? Because I think that if I had a different type of politic, I might have a different type of career. But it also has been exactly what it ought to be, in that I have had students who realize that there's another way to do this thing, right? That you can have politics that matter to people and still do academic work. And part of the historical task, I think, of being an academic is to democratize and redistribute resources, access, and power as much as possible. And I think that the other thing too is I believe my own analysis. And so I don't despair when shit is white supremacist and anti-radical and patriarchal and all sorts of other things in the academy. I believe my analysis. And so like, I'm disgusted, but it's not destabilizing to my being because I believe what I write. And there's so many people I feel like in academia where somehow they think that they believe in meritocracy, despite the fact that despite their critique of liberalism, they think that if they, they think that somehow they should be exempted from the very politics that they name because of their class position or because they've written some dope shit or whatever. The other way that I have persisted is I publish. That matters. And so, it's not going to protect me, but it's been enough that people are just like, there go that crazy bitch again. But I like her book, I like her whatever, you know what I mean? So, and to be fair, there's going to be contradictions in any area that you work, right? So if you worked on Wall Street, if you worked at Arby's, they got the meat. Where they get the meat from? I was like, but like wherever you work, there's gonna be. We're all participating in capitalism. I think academics are, of course, have a larger responsibility, but I just think that being as ethical as you can is the key, right?
You mentioned Wall Street. What is Wall Street imperialism?
So Wall Street imperialism is a relationship between financial capital and industrial capital, as well as the state and the private sector, that has a series of functions that I name. One is a particular exploitative relationship between the U.S. North and South, with the Negro question as its fulcrum. Anyway, so I have a whole definition of what it means, but basically Wall Street imperialism is a form of U.S. imperialism that has domestic and international workings. That is
make that concrete for us. So what does Wall Street imperialism look like? I guess in the context of your book, sort of historically, so for people who haven't read the book or who don't necessarily have the theoretical roots deeply, what might Wall Street imperialism look like in practice?
Wall Street imperialism looks like the majority of utilities, land, and insurance in the South, let's say in Mississippi, being owned by Northern companies like the Rockefellers. And because of that ownership relationship, much of the policy is set forth by the so-called oligarchs in the South. So the Southern plantocracy or post-plantocracy, but is sanctioned and legitimated by Northern owners of capital. And for a long time, that relationship kept the South relatively underdeveloped relative to the North, right? And part of that underdevelopment was predicated on the concentration of Black people as unskilled, underpaid, or unpaid labor up through like the Second Great Migration. And so that's an imperial relationship. It models the way that imperialism operates abroad, right? Up to and including that, like in the early 1900s, farmers in the South would call investments from the North like foreign direct investment, because that was the nature of the relationship. So that is like that's one reality of like Wall Street imperialism.
I'm gonna jump just for the interest of time. So someone here said we have socialism in the U.S., but for the elite and the wealthy. That's an expression that gets used a lot. It always, I understand what the person's saying. It grinds my gears. For
likewise, I've tweeted several times about this.
Okay, break that down and then use that as part of a conversation more broadly about sort of how we, even on the so-called left, understand socialism and what it is and how. Yeah, just go. I trust you.
Yes, socialism for the rich is called capitalism. That's literally how capitalism operates. That wealth, privilege, resources are concentrated at the top, and then that in turn determines how our society is organized. And so when people say socialism for the rich, it makes it seem like it's some sort of like one group can benefit from this thing from some, from this sort of tangential social system while everybody else cannot. That's not how socialism works. Socialism is a fundamental redistribution of wealth and resources whereby workers own the means of production. And socialism is the step before communism, which is the withering away of the state. So socialism still has like a state structure. So we haven't ever seen a communist system. We've seen only socialist systems. And so socialism for the rich is, so I guess like the upshot of that is like, if the rich can have socialism, then poor people deserve it too. But that's simply not how it works, because again, it's a relational system, right? If rich people had socialism, number one, they wouldn't be rich, and number two, everybody else would have it too. It's impossible. But people say that as a sort of like gotcha, like it's part of this like 99% discourse, which whatever. So I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding. It's because people don't know what socialism is, or they are so disdainful of it that they just throw this term around willy-nilly to apply to whatever it is they're trying to explain without really understanding what it means.
Is it changing? There's an opportunity now to think about, or at least to talk about socialism in public. Now, it's democratic socialism, it's DSA socialism, right? Which for some isn't a radical move at all. But I'm watching people run for public office. I'm watching people identify as democratic socialists, whether it's the Bernies of the world, the AOCs of the world. I'm seeing people embracing at least the language. Is that a sign of possibility, or are we watching the kind of co-opting of legitimate radical politics by liberals?
I think oftentimes,
I'm sure there's other possibilities too. Those are just the ones that pop in.
No, I just feel like the so-called socialists in Congress are like three liberals strapped up in a trench coat. Like, they're not socialists. They're like welfare state capitalists. They're really like New Deal Democrats, basically.
Yeah. Social Democrats.
Or the so-called, Scandinavian, right? They're for like a Scandinavian model of capitalism, but they call it socialism. I don't know. So to the extent that those folks can like stop the bleeding a bit, they're useful. So you can have like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or Dianne Feinstein, or you can have Cori Bush. I'll take Cori Bush, but what they think is possible and what's actually possible, there seems to be a large gulf, right? There's a saying in Spanish, entre dicho y hecho hay un gran trecho. And I feel like that applies. So they talk a big game. And let's be frank, these folks are simply elected influencers. They're not really representatives. Number one, because they go on Twitter and they grandstand and pontificate, and then they get mixed. That is to say, they fold like a lawn chair in their actual day job in Congress, right? They get outflanked. They have a fundamental inability to actually represent their constituents in a real material way. So they're just elected influencers. And to the extent that matters, like, okay, to have somebody who at least doesn't hate Black people, who at least doesn't hate poor people, sure.
There are people who are going to hear you say that and go, these socialists are never happy. No one's ever left enough. right? There are people who say that about DSA. There are people who say that about Fabianists, right? That they're just, radicals of the chair. They don't actually want anything that, what does a legitimate socialist intervention look like in mainstream electoral politics? What does it look like on the ground? Like, what is the level for you that becomes sufficient? I don't want to say sufficient, but to satisfy the conditions for a true socialism, what do you need to be doing? Where do your politics need to be? What do you need to be advocating for, etc.?
I think to have a true socialist politic, you have to belong to a movement, organization. You have to talk to regular people. You have to care about regular people. You have to push for policy, but you also have to do things day to day to satisfy the material needs of the community while engaging in political education, which is to say a different way of understanding the world. That is to say, understanding what it is we're critiquing and what it is that we're trying to build. And so I think that I don't know what socialism in the context of US electoral politics looks like, because again, this is such a deeply capitalist, pending fascist society. And this is why anti-communism is so important, is because historically, because of the US's endemic anti-radicalism that becomes enunciated through anti-communism after 1917, because of that, it has been much more amenable to fascism than to socialism. Full stop. And this is on the historical record. This is what I talk about in my book. And so there's not any way for a true socialist politic to actually be taken seriously in the United States, because it literally was criminalized for much of the 20th century and maligned for much longer than that. And so I'm not certain. And again, I think that it's important to perhaps hold the line, but we also have to keep in mind that what's left here is like a right of center internationally, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is a deeply right-wing society. Liberals are U.S. liberals are right-wing.
What does that mean? Because people are going to listen to that in this audience right here, and certainly later, and go, mm-hmm. That's way beyond the pale. That's absurd, right? What do you mean when you say American liberals are right of center, or American liberalism is right of center?
People who want to militarize the police, or who capitulate to those who do so. Single payer healthcare. Single payer healthcare is not, anytime that healthcare is tied to your job, that's like a right-wing policy, right? Especially when there's large levels of unemployment. Folks who think who defend equally freedom of speech by like racist white supremacists, as well as, I guess leftists, like that's like that both siderism. That's like a right-wing position. Yeah. And so these things are radical in the context of the United States, where like freedom here is like freedom to die. Sure, that's radical here, or that's left here. But globally, those are not like left positions. 2 weeks of maternity leave is not a radical position, right? There's places that we malign in the global South as backward and whatever. We use those as our comparison, that actually have maternity leave, right? They have, and anyway, I could go on and on, but so that's sort of what I mean. The policy prescriptions are right of center, the things that they advocate.
There's a couple people here who had questions. I want to bring up a couple of their questions. This seems to be a complicated one. I don't think you can answer all of this right now. And it's probably, but is there? They said, what's the difference between AAPRP socialism versus Uhuru House socialism versus New African Republic socialism, Marxist socialism, etc.? If you already answered, no worries. And I know you can't break down each one, but are there some my question would be, what is the sort of connective thread, outside of the just what's the connective thread, and what are some maybe differences among different types of socialist collectives, ideologies, etc.?
I would say that all of these purport to be scientific socialism. And the difference would be perhaps the what we might call the locus of enunciation, or what the specific material conditions are. So I am of the perspective that scientific socialism is not reducible to Marxism, that there are different iterations of scientific socialism, one of which is Ujamaa, for example. So for the AAPRP, their Pan-Africanism is the complete political unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And so they're really focused on the African continent, whereas New Africans are focused on sort of the 5 contiguous states in the context of the United States. And so that is that's the land that they want to free. And that's where they articulate their politics from. That's where most of their analysis derives from and is focused on. And so I think for I think Uhuru, I think that's the APSP. I'm not exactly certain. I think that perhaps it's a diasporic. I think it's Africa focused, but also US focused, maybe like an internal colonial model. I would have to read more about the APSP. I'm not certain, but I think that the differences are the sort of focus of where revolution will take place and what the landmass is, where Black people will be located, and who are the sort of central actors in revolutionary struggle.
And when you say scientific socialism, just for people's benefit, you're making a distinction between that and like a utopian socialism. You're saying, could you? And I just because some people here are new to the entire framework. When you say scientific socialism, you're talking about a kind of rooted in Marx. I would argue. I don't know. This is your expertise, not mine, but a sort of predictability and foreseeability of the kind of movement of history and change over time, the political economy, etc., based on historical patterns, but rooted in a kind of, really a kind of scientific method, right? Really being able to sort of predict what's going to happen based on these things. You can probably give a better description of that than I could. But sort of what I'm wondering about is sort of the alternative to a scientific socialism. What are alternatives? Because you said these kind of have the connective thread of a scientific socialism.
So I've been listening to a lot of Walter Rodney lately. And so an alternative to a scientific socialism, which he's critical of, is like this so-called African socialism. And so African socialism is something that was sort of advocated by like Senghor in Senegal, where it's like you have some socialism, you have some capitalism, you have some private ownership, you have some foreign direct investment, you have some public ownership. And so that's a form of African socialism because it's a hybrid of all of these different types of things, which is not socialism, right? Because ultimately the class relations haven't been altered. The sort of relationship to the mode of production hasn't been altered. And so, but African socialism was a phenomenon that was big, like especially in the early to mid 60s, whereby there was this idea of going back to like a so-called African communalism. So it was anti-capitalist, but it was also anti like Soviet Union or anti like Marxist socialism, conscientism. So Kwame Nkrumah's framework, right? That combined like a Christianity and Marxism. That was another form of like an African socialism, and so those are some alternatives to like a scientific socialism.
I have one more question for you because I know it's late now. I don't want to keep you too long, although I could talk to you for. I'm learning so much, and everybody is, by the way. The comments, everyone's very excited to learn with you, from you, study with you, etc. Someone said, "Is the productivity and technological development of capitalism a prerequisite for socialism? And if so, can we wrap up the capitalist stage soon, please?"
So Walter Rodney would say no. Mao would say no. Ujamaa is an example of where capitalism wasn't a prerequisite stage, but that was largely because Tanzania was a place that hadn't been as touched by the capitalist colonialist system. So a lot of their so-called pre-colonial, or what we might call classical African forms, were still intact. So it really just depends on the place. So this was what the Great Leap was about, right? It was this idea, even Russia, like the Russian Revolution. And so there's writings by Engels in particular, but also Marx, about the Russian situation that was about the potential of skipping the stage of capitalist development and going straight to a socialist society from what was then like a feudal order. So it really just depends.
One more question for you. Dr. CBS, would you say the genres of radical Blackness are different than they were in the early 20th century? You emphasized the West Indian outside agitator, the red black. How does that look now?
Yeah, I do think somebody else asked me this question. So I do think that there are, so the outside agitator, I say, was still there. Like we heard about outside, quote unquote, outside agitators all up and through, right? The encampments, all up and through the 2020 uprising. So I think that that's a durable one. I would say probably, I talked about maybe a new one would be like, you know, well, so in this, the Black identity extremist is another one, right? Or the extremist in general. So that idea of identity extremism actually comes out of the 60s and 70s, specifically out of the Black Liberation Army. So this idea of the identity extremist is another one. The thug, right? I think the thug or the criminal is another one that harkens back to particular aspects of the conflation of political dissent with criminality. But I think that the thug as a sort of way of characterizing particular types of radicals might be another one. And so I think that they build on older forms, but are probably distinct to the current ways that threats are articulated.
People are asking for your reading list, and I'm like, y'all don't want to see her reading list, y'all. But where should people start? You know, there are people right now who want to understand the history of Black socialism. They want to understand the roots of the Black radical tradition, and they just want to get free. And they're like, what do I need to read to help me nurture and develop the kind of analysis and the kind of praxis that you have? Where do I start? What do you say to those people?
There's a new collection, I think it's from Rookery Press, called The Black Liberation Army. It's like the writings of the Black Liberation Army, Volume 1. So that's a good one. I would say, honestly, read anything by political prisoners at this point. I'm very sold on, so good. Still Black, Still Black, Still Strong. Mumia's Live from Death Row. Mumia also has this really good trilogy that he co-wrote with somebody else. I forgot the man's name.
Even you talking about America, Death America. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, exactly.
There's a collection called, I think it's The Implacable Maroon. Is it? Yeah, The Implacable Maroon. Yeah, there's We Are Our Own Liberators, of course, the classics Blood in My Eye and Soledad Brother. There's Sophia Bukhari's The War Before. So I would just read the reason why I say read political prisoners is because they have the uncanny perspective about the confluence of repression, the threat of fascism, how capitalism, and then extreme forms of oppression and repression that apply to like Black and third world people. So, and they often cite like earlier, like other works. And then also, Angela Davis. So there's this abolition volume 1 that just came out. That's like a collection of her abolition writings. Think what you want about her, like whatever, but she was one of the very earliest people writing about prison abolition. Oh, if you read any of these books, here's the one that I actually recommend. It's called If They Come in the Morning. It's edited by Angela Davis, but it has writings by her, by Ruchell Magee, who I love, by the way. Like Ruchell Magee was awesome. And it talks about some of the other political prisoners at the time, like Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale. So I would start with the political prisoners because they're really clear. They're written, it's really clear writing, but it's actually it's really good, like theoretically. Asada, of course. So yeah, those are like good starting places. And anything by Gerald Horne.
Everything by Gerald Horne should be read. That's just there's no other way to put it. And you've had the benefit. I know you consider him a mentor. You've had the opportunity to write with him and to think with him.
Yeah.
And I think, and in fact, one of the goals for this, well, for July, I don't know if I can do it this month. One of the goals for July is to bring Gerald Horn into conversation with our community here. And
you must.
Yeah, because it's. I mean, it's just and we're gonna reserve like 2 or 3 hours just to really create space to break it down. I'm sorry, I know I said we're gonna let you go. I just got one more question.
No, I'm good. We good.
Okay. I know people with kids, I be hate. You know what I mean? I know time be precious. You know, especially quiet.
She with her dad. She sleep.
Talk to me about identity politics. The word gets used a lot, and it's used derisively by the right and also by the left for different reasons and at different times. But what do you mean when you say identity politics, and why? Based on how I think I understand your work, why is it problematic?
So to clarify, I think identity politics are important. We all have identity politics. Actually, the biggest purveyors of identity politics are white people. Zionism is a form of identity politic in a particular way. But identity reductionism is problematic. And this is the idea that there are particular subjects that are objectively revolutionary because of how they're positioned in the world. So whether it's like Black women, whether it's, queer folks of color, and all of the politics is reducible to one's identity. So it's when people say like, as a such and such. So it's like, if I'm like, well, as a Black woman, I believe this, and you can't challenge me because I have a particular will to knowledge because of the body I'm in. There is no body that is objectively revolutionary. There are particular perspectives that can derive from what I call structural location, but how you're situated in the world, of course, right? But you can be a Black woman and be Condoleezza Rice or Candace Owens, right? You can be a trans person and be Caitlyn Jenner. You could be a first gen person or a mixed race person and be Kamala Harris. And so identity reductionism is problematic because identity becomes the primary politic, right? Is defending your whatever your quote unquote intersections are against anybody else to assert authority. And that is not productive. So I think identity reductionism is super problematic. And I think it's very, very prevalent in left spaces because it's sort of a bastardization of like standpoint epistemology and some of the Black feminist work of like Kambahi or Patricia Hill Collins or other folks. And so that is something that we need to combat.
For sure.
Yes.
How then do you make sense of particular strands of feminist thought? Some of which might lean closer to the type of identity. I don't want to say reductionism because I don't think, but they may lean away from the type of political orientation, theoretical orientation you have. How do you, or is that the case? I mean, do you find that mainstream feminism is in line with those principles you're talking about?
I do. I think that there's a lot of U.S. feminism, Black feminism, even intersectional feminism that there's a book by Jen Nash that I recommend. It's called Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality. And she is a Black feminist and has a critique of intersectionality that I think is quite good about, about defensiveness and about originalism that I think is really good. But anyway, I think that ideology can't take the place of empirical reality, of study, and of a type of political humility that's really important. And this doesn't even apply. And this applies to, there's some Marxists that have none of those things, right? Some so-called Marxists, especially white Marxists. And so, but I think that there are forms of Black feminism that are compatible with empire. So there's people like, for example, who are rooting for Kamala Harris. They love Stacey Abrams, goofy ass Stacey Abrams. she bowed to Biden. I was already done before that, but that was crazy. And then your man Billy Porter kissing dude's hand.
That was kissing the ring, literally, but
literally. And so I think that those type of feminist politics that are compatible with imperialism, that are compatible with the reproduction of hierarchy, as long as the hierarchies are proportional. That is to say, there's enough women at the top, enough Black people at the top, enough Black women at the top. That's not a politic that's liberatory, and that's really just going to reproduce the status quo and make it actually harder to point out the contradictions, because there are people who look like us and who, so, there's that saying, it's basically like the trees kept voting for the axe because the axe handle was made of wood, so they thought it was one of them. And so we have to be aware of like the axe handles who are not one of us just because they look like us, but these are people who will not bust a grape in a fruit fight for us by any stretch of the imagination.
Is there a pragmatic decision to be made where we have to choose the person with the most wood in the axe because they both axes? I mean, there's a way that right now, as a member of the Green Party, I have, had this fight with liberals for the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And now that Cornel West is running for president and Claudia de la Cruz is running for president, people are starting to at least wake up to third-party possibilities, thinking outside of the two-party system. And whereas we as Green Party members, and I was talking to Jill Stein about this 2 weeks ago, we get seen as spoilers, as people who just grandstand every 4 years. People are starting to have a different conversation, I think. But then some people like Baldwin in 1980, when talking about Reagan and Carter, said we just got to buy time sometimes, right? Like that the vote for Democrat is not a vote for, it's not a belief in their possibility to save us, but it's just a means of buying time so that we can figure out what the next thing is. If we dismiss the idea that they're us and that they're for us and that they're going to be for us, if we take that off the table, how do you think about like the upcoming election, knowing that electoral work isn't going to save us, but thinking about it as a tactic? How do you approach election season?
Do you remember when Raphael Warnock and Joel Ossoff were like, you remember it was like their elections were so important,
right,
because they were going to save the Senate. Then Raphael Warnock literally invited like Zion, was like a peak Zionist, invited sort of Zionists in his church, repudiated I think he maybe had said something positive about Palestine, had to repudiate it. I don't even know what the Ossoff man is doing. I can only imagine. So Atlanta, Warnock's in Atlanta. They're building a cop city still. They're maneuvering and cheating to not have, a referendum to stop Cop City still. So, at a certain point, we just, I don't know. So I don't have an answer one way or the other. I just can point out these contradictions. I can point out these actual realities. And
that's how I feel. You just summed up how I feel. Like, look, I ain't got the answer for y'all, but I see these contradictions, and I find them harder and harder to ignore. As I'm watching Joe Biden literally underwrite, fund an indisputably genocidal war in Palestine.
I remember Nura Erakat. Maybe it was in 2016. Maybe it was later. I think it was in 2016, was talking about why we need to elect. Maybe it was in 2020. It was in whatever the last election, 2020, I guess, was talking about how we need to elect Joe Biden so that we can have more room to organize for Palestine.
Yeah.
I would think that in recent years, but especially within the last 10 months, she might rethink that position.
Maybe.
If that is, because here's the thing, people are fear-mongering about Trump because Trump was like, I would put down the students and deport them. What do you think Joe Biden is doing? He hasn't deported anybody, but in the House, they tried to pass a piece of legislation that would deport Palestinian students, right? And they are brutalizing students left and right. People are losing their jobs. People are having jobs rescinded. All sorts of stuff. And so the things that are being projected onto Trump are actually happening under Biden. The geriatric dirtbag. So I just would like us to have less fear mongering and to really analyze the objective situation.
And I think the challenge for some people is, sure, Biden is awful in every way imaginable.
More dust than man.
but so Biden allowed, I'll just give you a concrete example. Biden allowed the United Nations Relief Works Agency to be basically defunded, dismantled in the
because of lies.
Because of lies, right? Lies that were directly tied to an attempt to hold Israel accountable at the International Court of Justice. The same day the decision comes out, suddenly there's a binder with facts that's empty and yada, yada, yada. And
right.
And so effectively UNRWA, which is the only sustainable mechanism for funding Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, was suddenly gone.
Right.
And this is under Biden with absolutely no evidence, yet he supports Israel with a ton of evidence that they're committing genocide.
Mm-hmm.
But under Trump, UNRWA was completely cut. Biden restored it before cutting it under this circumstance. I say that to say, yeah, Biden's awful.
Mm-hmm.
But UNRWA was already cut under Trump in a more fundamental way. So if you're one of the people getting relief, if your school's being funded through UNRWA, if your healthcare is being funded through UNRWA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even if the difference in support you're getting is not insignificant. And so is that a reason to not only say, look, Biden ain't shit, but to say, yeah, but Trump is even less so. So let's just pick, as a practical matter, the person who gives us more relief. Or to use the Supreme Court example, Biden is terrible, but we probably wouldn't have lost abortion if Biden were president instead of Trump, and Biden had, or Hillary Clinton or whoever, and we hadn't been able to, and we've been, and different Supreme Court justices were appointed. Are those significantly measurable differences that provide relief to the vulnerable, that merit a consideration of a mainstream political candidate versus Green Party, working, party, et cetera, et cetera?
We can. Do you remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was basically saran wrapped to preserve the last breaths in her body, but would not retire?
Right.
Under Obama, because she was waiting for Hillary Clinton to be elected.
Right. She wanted to be there.
And Hillary Clinton lost. And that was the condition by which Trump was able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices. So we can do all this what ifs. We may not have lost Roe v. Wade. There has been, so I think Obama had ample opportunity to codify abortion in federal law and didn't do it because the Democrats are now using use abortion as a means by which to campaign. So we have 3 branches of government. There's all different ways that, and I read about the way the 3 different branches of government participate in like a fundamental anti-radicalism. But I think that there's different ways that the branches of government maneuver to sometimes to feign a modicum of progressivism, but generally to hold the line. And so I just and the other thing that we have to understand about the Biden administration is that he has spent his whole administration racing to the right in order to, in the name of quote unquote bipartisanship. So it's like, if you're going to be a right-wing Democrat, why not just be a Republican? I guess I would like to see an empirical scientific assessment of our material conditions now versus 4 years ago. And if they're not better off, then I think that we have to be more serious about the fear mongering that we're attributing to Trump and what has actually happened under a Biden presidency. It's a terrible situation either way you cut it. And I take your point about, right, UNRWA, the funding of UNRWA under Biden. There's always going to be some group that benefits a little more or a little less. But that can't be enough, right? That I don't know that can be the litmus test, because let's look at Sudan. What's Biden doing there? Let's look at Congo. And in fact, the federal court under Biden ruled in favor of Apple and these other corporations, number one, being able to use that they're not guilty of using child labor, that they cannot be held accountable for that. This is under Biden. So, we can't cherry pick the international situations we care about, number one. And number two, it's like shit and diarrhea. So, okay. I mean,
that is a
pick your poison, vote with your conscience.
That is a graphic depiction of, no, but I mean, you're right. And so ultimately alternatives are needed. You talked about sort of thinking beyond electoral politics. And of course, in your book, you talk about the different movements and waves and collectives that have helped to, help push us toward liberation. You've told us what to read. Mm-hmm. What do we do?
It's funny. I often say I have no solutions. I'm still trying to understand the problem. But what I do think is important is we have to get organized. The right is winning because they not only have more money than us, they not only have history, right, and institutions on their side, but they also are more organized. They have been, and they understand that everything is up for grabs. Every single institution, every single social and cultural issue is up for grabs. And so we have to get organized. We being those of us who are not on the right. And so that means joining organizations. It means having political humility and being able to make, to engage in forms of solidarity and political coalition. I think that we have to engage in political education. We have to study beyond like the mainstream media. I think that we need to organize where we're at. We have to turn to mutual aid and collective economics, not just in times of crisis, but sort of as a way of life. Because even though I don't think that, poor and working people have a lot, I think we have enough if we share, right? And actually doing that work, I think, engenders a particular type of ethic whereby we can envision a different way of like being in the world where we don't have to, where, it doesn't come down to which imperialist death dealer is going to make us suffer the least. I think that we can have a better, I think we can live better than that. We can have a better reality than that. But I do think that it starts with literally just the hard, drudgery, thankless work of just everyday quotidian organizing. And we got to stop with the celebrity culture. Talk to your neighbors. Don't worry about what these celebrities do or don't say about a particular issue. They're not going to save us. I think they should just shut the fuck up and just give the money. It's our money anyway. We are the ones buying their whatever. Shut up and just give money. Like, don't
old school way.
Anything.
That's what Harriet, Mr. B would talk about that.
Exactly. They're not going to save us. They're going to be a distraction. And oftentimes when they do say something, it's fucking asinine, right? Or it's so mediocre. It's been so both-sided by their publicists that it's not even worth anything. And so like we have to divest from celebrity culture. That is a huge thing. And that includes influencerism. All of that stuff we have to like care about ordinary, regular people and do like that day-to-day work. We have to care about like homelessness here as much as we care about what's happening in Palestine. We have to care about adjunct professors as much as we care about other issues that get more shine, but that we have to care about things that are not going to get us snaps and pats on the back on social media.
And that's hard.
That's what it takes. It's really hard. It's very hard because so much of politics is about grandstanding. It's about sort of being able to show, right? It's about a particular type of movement clout. And I think that we don't have time. Like, we don't have time.
How are you feeling about these third-party runs? With Green Party potentially, but also Claudia and Cornell's runs.
Cornell, goofy.
Why? Why do you say that?
Goofy. Why do I think Cornel West is goofy? I don't think Cornel West is goofy. I think
you mean the campaign, yeah.
Yeah, because in what states is he actually able to be on the ballot?
So it's funny you raised that, right? For two reasons. One, in the last week, there's been a lot of controversy that he's starting to get added to some ballots because Republicans are fighting to get him on the ballot for obvious reasons.
So in like Muncie, Illinois, where else? I'm just playing. I don't know.
No, they're putting them on in states, but the argument, of course, from Democrats is, well, yeah, Republicans desperately want you on the ballots in these states because that just means you're siphoning votes from Joe Biden. Although I think they may be overplaying their hand there, as we saw in 2016, excuse me. A lot of us who voted Green, a lot of people voted Green. It wasn't like they wanted something different than what what mainstream corporate politicians offered. So if you were voting Green, it wasn't like, well, I'm voting Green, and if not, I'm voting for Hillary, because that's the idea that the Green Party stole Hillary's votes. It's like, well, no, those people, if they weren't voting for Green, they may not have voted at all, or they might even voted for Trump. But
right.
And it's not an incoherent political ideology. It's a very consistent thing of we want somebody outside of the mainstream corporate system. And at that time, he represented that. But the other reason why I think it's interesting is because part of what Jill Stein said to me was that Cornell, his campaign is very much still wrapped up in individualism and the cult of personality, and that the Green Party is in every state, and it's an organized political machine, and it's bound up in party politics. It's a commitment, it's a community, it's a party.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's something to be said about that, and having to go through debates, having to have a convention, having to sort of earn the party's nomination, although he was going to get it undoubtedly. These aren't just perfunctory pro forma things, but they speak to the idea of we're building a party with an agenda and movements. Sometimes third party I'm not talking about Cornell right now, I'm speaking in general, from Ralph Nader to, just throughout recent history. Sometimes third party movements don't feel that way. They don't feel like they are about a movement. They feel like they're about that person. And so when you say sort of, can Cornell win, or is Cornell even registered in the states to be on the ballot? To me, it speaks to that bigger question of, why are we running? Because it ain't like if he was in all 50 states, he still wasn't going to win. So what are we thinking about?
And who is his mass base? Like, what organization is he in? Who is he responsible to? And I hate the fucking account. I'm never using accountability again, because people just say accountability. Like, shut the fuck up. But who is he responsible to? Who is he in community with? Like, seriously. I'm not gonna lie. I've side-eyed the man since he was in the Matrix. It just feels, I don't know. Whatever. I don't. Yeah, I don't. If it feels like a vanity thing, maybe he'll get a cabinet appointment.
I don't think he will take it, and I don't think he's gonna get one. I think it's
cooked. Yeah. So I just, I think that the third party runs the Communist Party, like the CPUSA, which I read a lot about. They always ran like a ticket, right? And so I think that that's sort of the model for PSL. It's like you run a ticket to be able to get your platform out there. Like W.B. Du Bois, he ran for the Senate in 1950, right, in New York, and he got a good amount of votes. Obviously, he didn't win, but I think it's a good way to get your platform out there, and it can be a good way to sort of organize and to sort of win people to your position. That's Claudia and Karina. That's them. Cornell doesn't have an organization. He doesn't have a party. He doesn't have a base. And so I'm not exactly certain what his motives are. Although one of my mentors, I won't mention their name, it wasn't Gerald, but they told me that he actually thinks he could win. He's running because he actually thinks he can win. So yeah, I don't know. But I also think that it's not people are making it into catastrophe. Like you're taking Biden's votes. Fuck Biden. And also, like, if he wasn't such a dirtbag, he wouldn't have to worry about he's losing votes. Nobody's taking his votes, right? These are votes that he wasn't going to get anyway, to your point. So, like,
and no one owns our vote. It's not like they were Biden's and somebody robbed them. Like, we vote for the person we want to win.
This is the stick up. Yeah. So do you know why didn't he run with the Green Party?
I'll tell you more off air, but the fundamental issue was, I don't want to give you an incomplete answer that would be misleading. So I'll say this. There was definitely a tension between Cornell and Jill Stein, who was managing him at the time. From Jill's perspective, it came out of nowhere. From Ajamu's perspective, it came out of nowhere, that everything was fine and that Cornell didn't want to have to go through the actual party stuff. I got to go through I got to participate in X number of debates. I have to get the nomination, at the convention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that he was being sort of reined in a way that doesn't allow him to campaign the way he wants to. From a lot of internal Green Party people, it was that he wanted to be more of an individual and not be part of a collective, not be part of a party. That we're building a party and a movement, and we're not just promoting one individual. That's their perspective. Cornell says there was internal white supremacy, and a lack of commitment to attending to white supremacy outside of the party, and that he lost tremendous respect for Jill Stein because of how she engaged him. But he's never given a public, and I haven't gotten a private answer from him. He hasn't given a public specific about what Jill or anyone else did. From their perspective, though, which I have more access to, it was third-party political organizing is not a small thing. It's not just hitting the campaign trail. It's not just giving speeches. It's not just being on TV. We worked decades. This is them speaking. We worked decades to get in all 50 states. We organized and struggled to be able to have to put competitive races in different cities, to be able to run for mayor, governor, etc. And if you've never run for office, you don't understand tactically what needs to be done, and also logistically what needs to be done. And so you need to kind of stay close to us and do this kind of work. And they feel as if Cornell wanted to just do the easy parts. That's the sense I get. Cornell, from what I understand, and he promised to tell me later what was going on, so I hope to find out at some point. But from what he said, the Green Party is just not what it looks like on paper, and that he wanted to work after he left the People's Party. He came to the Green Party because it made sense and because they have the ballots and because they have the access. I mean, it was a great marriage to me, in theory. But he said he encountered roadblocks, white supremacy, racism, anti-black racism, and other things that made him incapable of mounting the kind of campaign that he wanted to mount within that party. And so he was going to organize and get the ballots another way. And so, yeah, I'll tell you more off here, but that's that is the sense of it. There's more tea, I guess, off here, but the fundamental point is that it was a tension about that. I think speaks again to your point about influencers and what politics looks like. I don't think Cornell's right or wrong. I don't think Jill and John Moon are right or wrong, because I don't have quite enough information to make a determination. But I do know that whoever runs for president in a third party, unless it's a vanity run, you're running to advance the issues. You're running to advance an agenda, but you're also running, and this is the part that I'm critical of the Green Party with sometimes from inside. I say this all the time. We also should be, there has to be a tangible political project that goes beyond the presidential elections. I feel like too many people see us as people who show up every 4 years, grandstand and then leave. And I'm like, how many mayoralties could we win? How many city council seats could we win? How many? There's so much local work we could do as a party that I think we don't do. That would then make it harder for an outsider to come in and say, I'm going to take your party's nomination. I've run for president with y'all, which is often what happens. But I think that's a reflection, not just. I think it's too simple to say, oh, that's Cornell or that's Nader or that's whoever. I think it's us. I think it's us as a party failing to really make a dent in communities outside of every 4 years when we show up and tell our and virtue signal and tell everybody how much better we are, more principled we are than whoever the Democrat is. That's not enough, and that's how we end up here. Anyway, that's a very long-winded answer, but that's my read of it.
I just don't think Ajamu's gonna run in a white supremacist party. I mean, there's racism everywhere. And it seems okay. So he wants to be president of a white supremacist, anti-black settler colony, right? Cornell, but can't. So wouldn't navigating out of the Green Party be a microcosm of what the job would entail?
And I guess he's saying, in principle, he doesn't want to do that if he can get the same goal from outside the party. I don't think it's achievable outside of the party. I don't think it's achievable inside of the party, but to the extent that it's achievable, yeah, you need to be on a ballot. You need a movement behind you. You need to organize. I wanted Cornell to stay, and I wanted to help resolve the tensions between them. But I was a day late and a dollar short, and Cornell was already gone. Yeah, I was disappointed. Not in Cornell, but or in Jill, but in the outcome. Because I feel like we've all been comrades for too long. We've all worked and struggled together for too long for this to be the outcome.
Didn't he organize for Bernie?
He was definitely a, what's the word? It's not proxy, surrogate. I believe he was a Bernie surrogate for a bit. Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. Well, whatever. I mean, I feel terrible for the way they dragged the man, put all his business on Front Street. I don't think he deserved that, but beyond that, I can't really.
Cornel West is a decent person. He is a principled person. He's a kind person. He's a brilliant person, obviously. And I'm interested to see in the final analysis sort of how this all plays out and why do you think Ajamu refused to get? That's a good question. I think
Ajamu doesn't live here.
Yeah, I mean that's a great reason. I think the other reason is when Cornell left the party, a decision had been made in 10 to 14 days about who the candidate was going to be. And so it had to either be Ajamu or Jill. And Jill wanted Ajamu to run. And they had a battle back and forth about who was going to run. And Ajamu won the fight. He won the battle, the friendly debate between them. And I asked Jill, how did he win? He said, well, he said he wasn't going to do it. He refused to do it. So there was no one else. I mean, Jill didn't. I don't want people to think that Jill Stein just wants to keep running for president. She doesn't. I think she's over it. Her family's definitely over it, and she's ready to do something different. But with 10 to 14 days left, she was like, I can't let all the work I've been putting in for decades fall by the wayside by us not having a candidate in an organized campaign.
Well, why is there nobody else? Why did it come down? Just like, why did this come down to Biden and Trump? Why did it only come down to those two?
Well, think about it. Because of how our organizing process works and our nomination process works, I think it was more like, it would be like if Biden left now, it'd be like, and you said, why do we have to have Kamala? It'd be like, because it's too late in the game to not have Kamala. It was a situation where there are other people who could have been in the wings. But because everyone assumed it was Cornell, when he pulled out the process, it kind of left a hole that no one was prepared to pick up in 2 weeks. It was one of those kinds of things, and I can say, I mean, as somebody who was asked, I was asked to be Jill Stein's running mate in 2016. I don't know if I've ever said this in public, but yeah, I was asked to be her running mate in 2016. I declined, and then I was asked to run in 2020, and I declined. I'm saying that to say there have been attempts to bring in new people, and particularly people of color. But it's hard, and people, it's a lot. Running for president is a lot. Even because people think because it's third party, like, well, you ain't gonna win, so you ain't got to win an award. You know what I mean? How hard could it be? It's just speeches, and it's like, nah, it's complicated and it's intense, and there's a lot with it.
And people be in your business, and it's
oh yeah.
Laundry and all that, like
Right.
I said, they did that man so dirty, and it was not, and it was the Democrats. It wasn't even the Republicans.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. Well, good luck to all the candidates. I think I think that Karina and Claudia will help grow that party. That's a net positive, I'm certain. So
So are you gonna participate in the electoral process?
I am not.
Okay. Ooh, you gonna make some people mad.
My ancestors died, so I could do whatever the fuck I want. That's why my particular ancestors died. Nope. They told me yesterday. Yes, they did.
Well, I had my
Ouija board and everything. I had my Ouija board, and they said, "Girl, don't you stand on that line, cha-cha slime with these raggedy motherfuckers." I said, "You're right."
You don't get your ass out that line.
They said, "Don't do it, girl." I said, "Okay."
You are a ridiculous person. I appreciate it. Thank you for hanging out with us, yo. This was maybe the best office hours we have had yet. And I'm not just saying that, it really is. It's been incredible talking to you. I've learned a bunch. I know the audience here has learned a bunch. Everybody, I'm gonna show y'all her book one more time, because it's an amazing book, and we could do a study session just on the book. But and we should do a study session just on the book. She's brilliant, and it's brilliant. And I mean, I don't use the word brilliant a lot. I think in the university and in university culture, we tend to call people brilliant way too much, and most people we call brilliant aren't they're not brilliant. I'll just say it's overused. I'll just say
Thank you
but
so much for having me.
You actually are brilliant. And I appreciate it. And the audience, I promise you, appreciates it.
Not Mr. Clark, not Morgan Freeman as Mr. Clark.
That's right.
You smoke crack, don't you?
Smoke crack, don't you?
Oh my gosh! I just want to say one last thing. My mom did the cover of my book. She made this, so shout out to Elizabeth Burden. Yep.
Wow.
And that's Angelo Herndon. People are thinking it's my friend Jarvis Givens, who wrote the book Fugitive Pedagogy. I'm like, how the fuck would I have Jarvis on my cover? I'm not trying to shoot my shot. That's Angelo Herndon.
That is Jarvis-ish. I can see how somebody would think that's Jarvis.
It's Angelo Herndon.
Yeah, I can see how somebody would think that's Jarvis.
That would be a weird way to be like, Jarvis, have you seen my
that would be
book?
a crazy sub. That would be like a crazy sub. Like, yo.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here and for your great questions. I do have a podcast. It's nothing like this. It's a tiny little rinky-dink podcast I do with my best friend Layla, who I was on here with a month or so ago. It's called Life Study Revolution. We film Mondays at 4 p.m. generally speaking. So Life Study Revolution is here on YouTube. Check it out
Make
if
sure
you
y'all
want.
check it out. Make sure you follow her on all social media. I hope you don't feel. I do this every night. I break out the salt and vinegar chips after 11 o'clock. After that, food gotta happen. All right, check out, seriously, first of all, on all social media platforms you need to check out, but especially on Twitter. I learned a lot from your Twitter page.
People be dragging me, man. I be deleting tweets because the thing is, I'll be on my fucking off time on Twitter, okay? Like, I'm not giving you no sources. I'm not citing no sources. I'm not expanding. I'm not elaborating. And once people start to pile on, I'm deleting my shit because I don't have time. So, like I tweeted something about men in WNBA, and people were like, if you don't watch the WNBA,
I saw that one.
why you? And I was like, but I'm not doing the gender wars. Like, this is good and bad. Delete. So...
I was actually surprised at the position you took, not because I disagree with it, but just because it seemed a little more traditional feminist support than usually I see from your Twitter account. Again, not something that I disagree with at all. I expect you to go in a different direction with it. So when I saw that hate, you guys like, oh, you getting the regular mainstream, like basic hate, like you were getting hate.
Yeah,
it was fascinating to watch,
but it's not, I wouldn't say I just said it was peculiar. Like, motherfuckers talk about these women, like their work, their value, like their comportment and their behavior. That's very peculiar. Like, yep. Do you not see the irony in this? Like, and then you, of course, the racialization of it makes it like even worse. And I'm just like, that's crazy. But go off. But then crazy. People are like, you're being divisive or whatever, or whatever the fuck somebody said. And I was just like, I don't got time for this. Goodbye.
And delete.
Delete, exactly. Like, I'll just retweet a whole bunch of other shit. So yeah, but anyway, but I do, I tweet from time to time.
So check out the tweets, check out all the posts, definitely check out the podcast. It's dope. And you said it's every Monday?
Yeah, every Monday, generally speaking. Sometimes we'll go Tuesday or Wednesday, but Monday at 4 p.m. we go live and talk about life, study, and revolution.
Y'all.
It's very raggedy. Very raggedy. So.
It's I promise you.
Low budget.
Shit, this is low budget. I just learned how to move my fingers real fast on the StreamYard keys. I mean, this is real basic. I'm like super basic. I have a producer princess who set up the background for me tonight, so it looks a little more fancy than it is. But
very fancy.
But check it out, y'all. Check out the podcast. Read everything she's ever written. And we'll have you back on soon just to help us break down and learn more stuff. Good to see you as always.
Likewise. Thank you. No, the podcast is not an Apple because we raggedy and we don't know how to do that.
I'm gonna help you get it on Apple. We're gonna talk about that. We'll figure.
Okay. All right. Thanks, y'all. Thank you, Mark.
Everybody, this has been the longest and definitely my favorite office hours. Make sure you check out everything on the channel, though. If you didn't catch the beginning of this, rewind it. Make sure you share this content as well. Charisse is brilliant and wonderful, and I really mean that. So this is just a privilege to have her on. Because we've had some of these office hours with some folk, and I was like, oh, I don't know about this person, but this was fire. And lastly, everybody, thank you for supporting. Make sure you hit the like button. When you hit the like button, it lets the algorithms know that this is a channel that you appreciate and this is content that you want. It helps us fight the uphill battle against corporate media outlets. This is a grassroots media outlet that's funded by the people. So if you want to keep the content going, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It expands our footprint in the digital space. And of course, if you're so inclined, hit the join button and become a monthly subscriber to the channel. A couple of people have been monthly subscribers to the channel and they joined today. I just want to shout out real quick, Madrugada, for joining today. Jason Wakeman gifted 5 memberships to the channel. Victor Tabu Roserath, thank you for not just contributing to the conversation with your brilliant comments today, Victor, but also thank you for becoming a member. Karen D gifted 10 memberships. Some of y'all grabbed them joints. And Jason Wakeman, in addition to the first 5, gifted another 10. We appreciate all of that. In addition to that, though, family, if you want to join the channel yourself, for as low as $3.99 a month, you can become a channel member. If you're already a bronze member, consider upgrading to silver or gold. And then lastly, if you don't have the resources to make a monthly commitment to what we're doing here, I totally understand. If you want to make a one-time donation of anything, even if it's just $1, to just go to our Cash App. Just go to our Cash App and or our PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle, and just drop it in. If everybody who's watching tonight were to make a contribution of $10 for the month for all the content that we provide, it would allow us to meet our goals. And the goals are simple. We're building a studio, and I want to pay every single person a living wage who works for me, and I'll continue to do that. And it's easier to do that with some support. There's no billionaire here. There's no corporate media outlet underwriting us. It's all the power of the people. So if you could do that, if everybody could donate $10 this month for Israel's War on Gaza report, for Night School, for Office Hours, for the Coffee and Books podcast, for the Classroom in the Cell with Mumia Abu-Jamal podcast, all of it comes through your strength. So we ask to donate what you can. But again, one more real quick shout out to M here, who just gifted 5 memberships as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. But if you don't have any money, that's okay. If you don't have any money to donate, I mean, that's okay. Just support. Hit the like button, hit the share button, share the content with folk, and again, hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, but it helps us to expand the reach of the work. Anyway, y'all, I'll be back in a few minutes with the War on Gaza update. It'll be a short one because it's late. And then we'll be back tomorrow with a full day of channel content. So thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all soon. Peace.